This is Matthew McConaughey.
Natalie Portman.
James Patterson.
Michael Ian Black.
And you are listening to
Five Questions
with Dan
Schawbel.
Graham, welcome to Five Questions.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's great to be here.
What originally inspired you to become a comic book artist?
My sixth grade teacher brought in a stack of comics for the kids to read during recess. And I'd known about, certain characters from other media. But when he brought in that stack of comics, that's when I really honed in on it. There was a Justice League comic. This is 1974, so they had those 60-cent giant comics back then. So there was one new story and a whole ton of Golden Age and Silver Age stories. And there was just something about those characters and the bright colors and the dynamics and the action and stuff that really spoke to my 12-year-old heart. And that's when I decided right then and there, from the time I was 12 years old, I wanted to write and draw comics.
None of my teachers throughout my life brought in any comic books. I had one teacher actually in elementary school that brought in cigarettes, but that's a different story, not comics. We didn't learn much from that, and it probably hurt our health, right?
Wow. Some teacher.
Well, you're very well known for coming up with Bane. I'm a massive Bane fan. It's one of my favorite villains in the DC universe. Cool. How did you originally come up with Bane or co-create Bane? And what was your reaction when you saw the character in The Dark Knight Rises?
Well, the first part of the question, Chuck Dixon and I created Bane as a necessity for a storyline. Denny O'Neil, who was the editor of the group editor of all the Bat titles, was getting a lot of letters from fans. This is, again, early 90s, when Wolverine and the Punisher were like the top sellers. And those two characters dispatched the villains. They killed them. And people were saying, well, Batman needs to get more violent and kill them. And Danny thought that was a really bad idea. But I gave him the idea, well, why don't we give them what they want and show them why it's not a good idea? So that was the germination of the Nightfall storyline, where we're going to take Bruce Wayne out, replace him with Azrael, who was a meaner, psychotic guy who had no problems killing people, and show the difference, compare and contrast. And but we needed a new character to do it. There was nobody in Batman's rogues gallery, obviously, that had done it before, so they couldn't do it. So we needed somebody new. Chuck came up with the idea of an evil Doc Savage. And Doc Savage was a pulp character that inspired Superman and James Bond and thousands of other characters. He's one of the progenitors, I guess you would say. And so I thought that was a really great starting point. So Chuck and I talked about this character's background and stuff, and he was going to be born into prison to serve the life sentence of his father. Pretty draconian, but a really cool concept. So when I had to design the character, I started with Doc Savage, big, muscular type of thing. I roided him up, which is why I always draw him with the hair on his shoulders and the pimples and stuff, which is an after effect of steroids. And then I figured, if he had a costume, what would he be exposed to living where he was living? So I gravitated towards a Mexican luchador. And that's how that look came up.
Yeah, and then the second part of the question about The Dark Knight Rises and your feeling, in my opinion, that's the best version of Bane from a cinematic perspective. I think the other ones didn't capitalize on a lot of his, let's say, intelligence and other attributes.
Well, it's really a double-edged sword. When I first saw it, I thought, oh, okay, it doesn't look like Bane, but he's kind of acting like Bane. But then the movie goes completely off the rails. And everything that we've been told about this character, that he's this great tactician, this planner, this schemer, who's in charge, he wasn't. He was a lovesick puppy dog that was being used by Talia. So the short answer is I was disappointed. It's really not a good movie, and it's not a good representation of Bane.
Yeah, I did love the scene where obviously Bane breaks Batman's back. Batman 497. That's from my childhood, that's my favorite comic.
Yeah, sure.
And so that was for sure fan service. But yeah, it's disappointing that, he didn't live up to your standards.
Yeah, well, it would have been nice if they asked Chuck and I for our input. We could have given them a
That's a
lot of,
problem.
yeah, so there's that.
Speaking about your collaboration with Chuck Dixon, why do you think it's so successful, and how do you support each other?
Well, Chuck and I view comics from a very similar prism, the storytelling aspects. So we're very much in simpatico when we work together, but we're also such good friends that we can be completely honest. And like, Chuck will send me a script or something, and I'll say, "This stinks." You know, this scene doesn't work or whatever. Or he'll say something. I'll send him some pages I did, and he'll say, "Oh, I really hate circular panels." So so it's a wonderful collaboration where we can just be completely honest, and not, there's no hard feelings or anything about it. It's like, because we both want the same thing: create great stories.
Well, that's really important. I mean, there's so many different people who collaborate with others where there's a lot of friction, and people end up separating. They don't have a long-term relationship like you've had with him.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been working since first time we worked together was 1986 on at Eclipse Comics. Chuck was writing Airboy and the backup feature, which was Skywolf, and then I got assigned like a bunch of fill-in issues on Skywolf, and that's the first time we worked together.
And now
We've been at it ever since.
but you're working more independently. So what types of stories have you been telling at Compass Comics that you couldn't have told at the big publishers, and why?
Well, I'm a genre guy. The American comics is pretty much just superheroes when you get down to the big two. And I played in that sandbox for 40 years, and I wanted to do other stuff. Before I got into comics, I was a monster kid. I read monster magazines and I watched monster movies and stuff like that, even before that teacher brought in those comic books. So I wanted to do a universe which was basically focused on monsters, supernatural, science fiction, that kind of stuff, but all that wrapped around high adventure, because that's the other aspect that I love of stories with just men versus the elements, men versus adversity, that kind of stuff, and then you stick that type of high adventure into a horror genre, and it's a whole different thing, and that's what I'm doing.
And if you tried to pitch those ideas at some of the bigger publishers, it would be much more difficult to sell those, because they don't have that proven track record of Batman from like the 40s, etc.
Well, the reality is that my first 2 or 3 books were all pitched to publishers, and they all turned them down.
All of these books behind you were turned down by every publisher besides one. So I can relate.
Yeah. And so I decided, well, I'm just going to publish it myself. And I did. And each one was bigger than the last, much more successful than if I had used another publisher.
Absolutely. Well, and the other thing with publishers too is if they somewhat believed in it, they might not have pushed it as hard enough, and then that would limit its success, and then it would be hard for you to kind of build that back up.
And they'd have owned half of it.
Yeah. Well, Todd McFarlane has done also a good. He's also been on this podcast, and he's done a good job of going independent and building the brand and all of that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the publishing paradigm has changed, particularly in comics, since years gone by, when you had the big two in a monopoly, and it really was a monopoly because they controlled distribution as well. and so if you wanted to make it and get a paycheck and working in the bigs, you got to work for Marvel or DC.
It's like Coke. It's like Coke and Pepsi.
Yeah, and you bring your best ideas to them, and they take them and they own them, and they'll chew you up, spit you out, and you're done. Now with crowdfunding and social media, you can reach your audience directly. You're cutting out all the middlemen, and you own everything. So to me, it's one of the best times in my career.
That's great to hear. And what's your best piece of career advice?
For comics?
Overall.
Find your passion, and find what you're good at, and learn about what that business is that you want to do, and then go for it.
Yeah, the education part can't be said enough, right? It takes a long time to learn as much because
Absolutely.
you need to know more than basically everyone else.
Right. Well, like let's just assume the question concerns comics. And you're somebody that's coming up, you're a young writer or artist, and you want to do comics. That's all fine and good, and you need to work on those talents to get to the professional level, to where you're competing with people that are being published already. But you got to know the business. You got to know the business side. You can't just go in there as a starry-eyed artist or writer and say, I just want unicorns and rainbows, as I sit at my desk and draw. You got to know the business end and how to deal with that, and how to navigate it. It's very, very important. And I would say that would apply to just about every business.
Completely agree. Well, that's great advice. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.